My name is Parag Mehta.
And I'm Vaibhav Jain. Hi, everyone.
And we are so proud to be hosting this event in a series that is so aptly named Proud Possibilities. Before we begin, I just want to thank Aruna. You're so humble, Aruna, to call yourself tech support. I didn't know that was code for visionary leader, but that's what you are. And Aruna has become sort of auntie and friend and big sister to so many in our communities, and really a champion for us. We had the chance to see Aruna earlier this week at a historic event at the White House, celebrating Diwali with a lot of participation and visibility from queer and LGBTQ Desis, and that is in large part thanks to her leadership. I just want to say a word about the title Proud Possibilities, because about 20 years ago, I worked on a campaign in Texas, my home state, where we were trying to elect the first African-American to the United States Senate from the South. And I remember talking to a group of college students at that time and saying, this is not just about making history. We always talk about making history, but this is about making possibility, because history is about the person. History is about the individual who breaks that glass ceiling or forges that new path. Possibility is about the rest of us. And this series has featured so many incredible speakers, including the one you're going to hear from today, who are not just about making history, they're about making possibility for the rest of us. So we are so proud to be a part of this series. Aruna, we thank you for inviting us, and I'll turn it over to Vaibhav to introduce our guest speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vaibhav Jain. I use he, him pronouns, and I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed guest today, who is Ruth Vanita. Ruth uses she and her pronouns and is coming to us today from Missoula, Montana. She began her career in my beloved hometown of Delhi, where she taught in the English department at the University of Delhi, just a few kilometers from where I grew up in Model Town. A recently retired professor from the University of Montana, Ruth was a co-editor of The Same-Sex Love in India, a literary history published 22 years ago. She has published over 70 scholarly articles and translated several works of fiction and poetry, both in Hindi and in Urdu. Ruth helped launch Manushi, India's first nationwide feminist magazine, and served as its co-editor for 13 years. And I'm a little bit fanboying over here, because when I grew up in Delhi and, I was still, exploring my sexuality almost 12, 15 years ago, I had read about Ruth, and it is such a pleasure today to actually see her, even though virtually. I'm very, very excited and, excited to learn what Ruth has to share with us today.
Talk to us a little bit about what got you interested in this field. What made you want to pursue this area of study and to tell this particular history?
Well, when I was studying at Delhi University, the subject was never mentioned in class, even when we read authors who were obviously gay. And we wanted to know, both Salim and I wanted to know about this in our own history, which we knew nothing about. And so we just started making a list of for 20 years, both of us separately had been collecting everything that appeared in the press. And there I had been collecting these stories of these young women who committed joint suicide or who got married to each other by religious rights. And I didn't quite know what to make of these stories, but I had been collecting them and a lot of other material as well. And then we started looking in the literature so we basically started reading. So I read the Mahabharata and the Purans and so on, and he was working on the Urdu and Persian. I was working on the Sanskritic and the modern languages, other modern languages. And that's how, it was a process of educating ourselves basically in what there was and that we didn't know there was.
When you started doing this field of research, did you encounter any pushback from your colleagues in academia? Did anybody try to dissuade you and say, Ruth, this is not a serious area of study, or this is not something that we should be pursuing? Or did you feel like you had support both in India and then when you came to the United States?
Well, no, in India, I never had any trouble of that kind. In fact, when I wrote my first book, which was on English literature, it was called Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love in the English Literary Imagination. And I went back, I wrote that while I was on a postdoc for 1 year in the US. My PhD was from India. And I went back to Delhi, and my elderly professor, I think they were just good liberals, and he was so thrilled about it, and he pinned the cover on the notice board. So no, I always got support, but that doesn't mean there wasn't talk behind our backs. Like, there was a lot of talk behind our backs, not just about the work, but about lives. And I have either the gift or the misfortune of being pretty oblivious. I just don't know. And so I didn't know, but then it would sometimes come back to me. But we both of us had that sort of thing. It was not about the work so much as about the life, because of course the work doesn't mean that you necessarily are gay, right? You're just doing the work. Right. But yeah. All right. So I'm going to talk today about marriage equality and its history in India. Right. So I have two basic points. One is that since 1980, these young, low-income, non-English speaking couples all over the country, most of them are women, there were some men too, they had no contact with any movement. They didn't know any word like gay or lesbian. They've been getting married and committing joint suicide as a form of union. And this continues till today. And these women include Dalits, tribals, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, fisherwomen, factory workers, agricultural laborers, college students, a whole range of backgrounds from all over the country. And I was collecting these clippings since 1980, but I couldn't understand why they were choosing this marriage of language of marriage or death. And that's what my book is basically about, Love's Right. And the second reason why marriage equality is not an idea imported from the West and is not an upper class phenomenon is because Indian literature going back at least a millennium contains references to same-sex marriages and unions, more than a millennium, actually more or less 2 millennia. This is the first wedding that made headlines in the Indian press. These two young policewomen in Madhya Pradesh who got married in a temple. And then their getting married was interesting enough, but more interesting was that once they were suspended from their jobs and went back to the Urmila's village, Urmila's family held a wedding reception for them in her village. And when journalists descended on the village and asked questions, Urmila's neighbor, who was a village school teacher, she told a journalist, after all, what is marriage? It is the wedding of two souls. And where is it said that it has to be between a man and a woman? So I thought this very interesting, and an ordinary village school teacher is asking this question. So I have collected about over 200 such cases from the press, which in the latest edition of my book, which was just last year, and there'll be a new edition soon. My book was published in 2005 when it was not an issue in India yet. But now that it has become an issue in India, there's much more interest in the book. So this is a typical case. So these two young women, they eloped to escape the neighbors. Then they came back to the village, and after a lot of struggle, the priest agreed to marry them. And the village elder says they love each other, so we decided to forgive them. And one of them had been married to an alcoholic. They both work as day laborers. So you can see by looking at them that nothing could be less upper class, upper caste, or anything of the kind. There's no English or Western influence. They love each other and they want to marry each other. That's what the village elder himself says, right? Okay, let's go to the next one. I'm just giving a few of the examples of these women whom I consider to be the pioneers of the marriage equality movement. In many cases, they actually went to I'll show you, when they went to the marriage registrar and asked to be, that they wanted to register their marriage. And of course, they were turned away. But I'll give you examples. So this is a note as late as 2018. And if you can read Gujarati, you can see it's written on the paper plate. And this is what many of the women left suicide notes saying, in the next birth, we will meet again, or we'll be married in the next life. And that is why I think that rebirth is such an important, specifically in India. We know that there is a very high suicide rate among LGBT people everywhere in the world. But this phenomenon of joint suicide and getting married by religious rites, but also joint suicide is particularly Indian one, I think, maybe Asian in general. And this idea that we will live rebirth as a sort of enabling idea into more than one way, which I will discuss later. So these two young women, and the latest cover of my book is based on this photograph. They are very, very young, as I don't know if you can see from the pictures. They went to this temple in Varanasi. They're from a village and they got married there. First, the priest, so Hindu priests, of course, some of them agree to officiate, some don't. So he agreed, and then he finally had to agree. And they said, when they were asked, they said that they did this because they wanted the families to stop harassing them, and they wanted to make it very clear that this is what they want, that they want to be married. They don't want to just be friends. And there's a huge difference between that. So this is the book. It's called Love's Right, which is a quotation from Shakespeare, the perfect ceremony of love's right in one of his sonnets. So the first upper class kind of wedding that I ever heard of in India was in New Delhi in 1993 between Aditya Advani and Michael Tarr, and they were on the US cover of my book. And I'll come back to this later. So one of the things I was most interested in, so violence is one thing. Many families try to forcibly separate the couples, and then sometimes they are driven to suicide because of that several times. But what I was most interested in is the many families who came around and actually arranged the marriage. So this was 2001. And in Patna, these two young women, one is a nurse and one is a health worker, they got married. There were 200 guests at the wedding. To save money, many families often marry two siblings at the same time. But that shows that it's the same, the priest is seeing it as the same marriage. And that is why, though we use the term same-sex marriage, marriage equality is a better term because it is marriage. It is the same thing. It's not different. And that is what the priest and the family shows when they both get married at the same time. After that, they went to the registrar of marriages and tried to register their marriage. And it was a woman registrar. And she said, no, you can have any ceremony you want, but the government doesn't recognize it. And after that, the landlord of the flat in which they were living threw them out of the flat. So it's one thing to get married, but it's another by religious rights. But it's another thing if you do not have government protection, you do not have the protection of the law, you can lose your jobs, as those two policewomen did. You can lose your house, as these two women did. So that's the importance of getting the legal right to marriage. The religious ceremony is not enough. In today's world, at least. This is the temple in which they got married. It was built in the 13th century. This is the temple in which those two young women got married. I just wanted to show you. So I've been personally involved in some of these runaway marriages where the women's needed a place to stay. And there's so many organizations in India nowadays, they're all of them are funded. Manushi was not a funded organization, but things have changed now. And it's very difficult for these women because there is no place for them to go. The organizations are not these. This is one of the very few organizations where if you contacted them, they kept these women in their own house. And in one case, the woman's father, who was a policeman, came and beat them up and got into the house, beat up Betu, who was all of 5 feet tall and has now unfortunately passed away. But so it's quite a struggle in many cases. And that is why I say that these women are the pioneers, but also the martyrs of the movement. In many cases, they first got married and immediately committed suicide. So this idea of being married in the next life. So they get married and then they commit suicide or they attempt suicide. So they are actually the martyrs of the movement for marriage equality. This is another example. And you can see that it's often cross-caste, it's often cross-class, but it's more often cross-caste than cross-class. And it is always in the same region. These are women who have just met each other in the same village. I'm saying women because they're mostly women. As I said, there were one or two men as well, few male couples as well. This is a very interesting, now that there is YouTube and there are videos, you can go and listen to the video on this, several videos of these young women who are from a village. And one of them has the support of her father, who is in the police, interestingly, and that is why they have managed to survive. They went to the registrar of marriages, garlanded each other, and just to tell the families that this is what we are doing, and to tell the registrar. Of course, the registrar didn't register the marriage. The families had forced them to marry men. They left the men and came away, and they signed a contract in court. This is one thing that many women used to do, is to sign a kind of a friendship contract. In Gujarat especially, this was done, but this is in UP. This case is in UP. So what often happens in the cases of these young women, like in this case, is that after it comes into the media and becomes public, the families continue to put pressure on them. They're brought into court. And from the 90s onwards, the courts have always said that two adults can live together. The courts have never tried to separate them. So that is fine. You get the support of the courts. But in court, often so much pressure is put on them that one woman backs down. That's what happened in this case. So Rajvinder backed down and went back with her family, and then Baljeet attempted suicide. So that also happens. Now, this is a very interesting story. I don't have a picture of the women, but it's a lovely story. There again is a Mahamaya goddess temple in Assam, where these two tribal villagers, Tingring and Royanati Basumatari, they got married in 1999. And there have been more than one report and interviews of them. And they told the story of how in their village they were whipped and they were treated very much mistreated. They ran from village to village to find some place where they could stay. They're very poor. And all the villagers refused them. Finally, they found a village where they could settle down, and they settled down there. And they had lived there for many years. When they were interviewed, it was, I think, around 2012. So one of them is a domestic worker, and the other one is an agricultural laborer. And they talked about it. Then, interestingly, there were legislative assembly elections. And when the candidates came to the village, the villagers said to them that these women, this is long ago, this is around 2012, said that these women are our neighbors and they should get some rights. They should have some rights and you should work for that. So the villagers asked for that. The candidates were taken aback and said, yes, we'll try. And then Tingring, who was interviewed, said, we poor people only live in hope. All we have is hope. So we don't know if the candidates will really do anything, but all we have is hope. Okay, so I mentioned the marriage of Aditya and Michael. So now I do want to say that, when it's dismissed, very often people dismiss the idea of same-sex marriage by saying, oh, it's an upper caste phenomenon, it's a Western idea, and anyway, poor people are so busy surviving and this is not their. That's not true. So I've given you enough cases to show that there are poor people who may be busy surviving, but they have other desires besides just survival also. But also, even for the upper caste or middle class professionals, it's not as if it's all smooth sailing. And that's what I want to show you. So this is Aditya and Michael, who lived in San Francisco and then relocated to Delhi and have been living in Delhi now for 12 years or so, and they had these children, Shiva and Amrita, in Delhi. Now their kids are now 10 years old. And so what happened is when COVID happened, Michael, the thing is, because Michael is an American, he cannot stay in India for longer than 6 months, okay? And so he, every 6 months, and I know this, many of us know this from personal experience, after 6 months, he has to go out of the country and come back in because he's on a tourist visa. He has no status in India. You can't open a bank account, you can't hold a job, you can't do anything basically. You're living there as a tourist and you're a legal alien to your husband and your children. That's the situation. So he had gone to England to see his mother because he had to go out after every 6 months. And COVID happened. So then nobody could come back in. But after some time, foreign spouses who have an overseas citizenship of India, an OCI card, they could come back in. They were allowed back in. Now, if you're a man and a woman getting married, if you're an Indian man marrying a Western woman, okay, and you do that the very next day, they can apply for an OCI and they become, now they have been together since 1993. They were married in 1993 by religious rights, and they have no rights in India at all. And there are more stories, but then it'll become too personal, so I won't tell. Okay, so this is one thing. So the first thing is that the importance of marriage in marriage equality today is twofold. One is that it's a movement which comes from the grassroots, not from the leadership. As I've shown you, I've given you enough cases from 1980 onwards. These young people have been running away, getting married, committing joint suicide. Okay. Secondly, that it matters very much in real life terms. So I gave you the example of having to go out of the country every 6 months. Another example, a young woman I know in Delhi, she was living with her partner. They would have married if they could have. They were living for 2 years, and the partner was only 28, suddenly died of a brain hemorrhage. Now, as soon as she died, she fell ill, seriously ill. Her family came from another town, and they saw the partner as a roommate. So they saw her as a roommate. They just took the partner who was ill and took her away to the other town without consulting her partner at all. And when she died, they came and took away all her stuff, right? Everything. So if she had been the wife, she would have rights to make the medical decisions, the funeral decisions, etc. Being viewed as a roommate, she has no rights at all. So, and the mother of the other girl did know that she was the partner, but she didn't speak up. Okay, so and the other reason why it is not a Western phenomenon is that there are antecedents in Indian literature going back a very long way. We could go back to the Mahabharata, but I'll just go back as far as the 11th century, which is long enough. And the Katha Sarit Sagara is an 11th century story cycle in Sanskrit. In this, there are these two men, without going into all the details, they fall in love at first sight. That's not my translation. That's C.H. Tawney's translation, the first British translator of the text. He translated into English in the very early 20th century, I think around 1901, and he translates it as this: they fell in love at first sight, and then they live together. One of them gets married, the other does not get married. So all the three are living together, and then some various things happen in the story, and they remember their past lives. This is where rebirth comes in. So Vasudatta remembers his past life, and he jumps off a cliff. Then his wife follows, and then Pulandika also jumps off the cliff. There are many cases of men dying for other men. We know about Sati. There are many cases of men dying for other men. I might write about this at some point. And this is the text explanation of this kind of relationship. There's one between two women as well in the same text. So it basically says, Vakti janamantara pritim manaha sneha dikaranam. So affection that arises in the heart without a cause speaks of love persisting from a former birth. This is, of course, a very commonplace sentiment in Indian texts and Hindu texts. It's an explanation for any kind of strong like or dislike that you you have that you cannot explain. And it persists today. Even today in modern India, many, many Indians, including non-Hindus, have said to me things like, if you say, oh, I don't know what I did to deserve this, it must be from the previous birth, right? So this is our explanation of anything that cannot be really explained. Very like, and this explanation has been given to me by priests and by ordinary people about why people of the same sex fall in love. It is also in this text. It's also given as an explanation for cross-class and cross-caste socially disapproved relationships. There's a case where a so-called untouchable guy falls in love with a princess, and he knows that it's impossible. He says it's as impossible as a crow falling in love with a swan. That's exactly that kind of impossibility cross-species relationship is very often also the metaphor for a same-sex relationship in many texts. So that's what he says. And then everybody has dreams. So he is starving himself to death. The girl is starving herself to death. The parents are upset. Then the father of the girl has a dream. And in the dream, he sees that the two of them were married in a previous life. Okay, so he says, then it's fine. They were married in a previous life, so they are destined to be married in this life. Then the Brahmins of the city say, no, this is not allowed, and we are all going to starve to death. So they all protest by starving themselves to death. As they are starving themselves to death, they have a dream, and they also dream that these two were married in previous life. Now they accept it, and they all eat together. They eat at the boy's father's house, the so-called untouchable boy's father's house. Everything is fine. So rebirth is the way in which we explain and legitimize, one of the ways in which we explain and legitimize socially disapproved relationships. It's a very interesting phenomenon which I've written about. Okay. So in this text, Katha Saritsagara, there is a term Swayamvara Sakha, self-chosen male friend, and Swayamvara Sakhi, a woman self-chosen female friend. Now look at the word Swayamvara. We usually think that it is about a woman choosing her own husband, but the literal meaning of Swayamvara, Swayam is self, Vara is choose. So groom is the one you choose, but Vara is choose. And so Swayamvara Sakha means a man's self-chosen male friend whom he chose himself, and same for a woman. So in this text, there's also a story about two women, Somaprabha and Kalingasena, who fall in love at first sight. And then Kalingasena asks herself the question, like, why am I having these intense feelings for her? And then very interestingly, she thinks of of some earlier female friends in an earlier text who were very strongly attached. And she says, I'm not the only one. Earlier, this happened earlier. So what I am doing now, which is looking for earlier examples, she was doing at that time, looking for an earlier example of very intense female friendship. So I'm, of course, skimming the surface at this point. Much more could be said about ancient texts, but here's an example. This is if you want to see it, it's in the Asian Art Museum in Seattle. It's a larger than life-size statue of the god Kamadeva, who's the god of love and desire, shooting an arrow at two women. And bad reproduction, but if you can see the faces, they have this blissful smile on their face. The Kama and the two women have the same blissful smile on their faces. One more example from the Hindu text in the 14th century, the Kritivasa Ramayana, where there are various versions of this text, but the basic point is that two women who are widows, they fall in love and they embrace each other, they make love, and then one of them gets pregnant and they can't understand. This is the only text in the world, I think, from this period. I have, as far as I know, I've asked many scholars, where after the physical relationship, one of them gets pregnant. So it kind of seems to me imaginatively forecasting what can happen many centuries later. Of course, the author would have seen many co-wives raising the children together. So co-wives being co-mothers is a common procedure, right? Rama calls all his father's wives as his mother. So the two are co-wives, they fall in love, they are widows though, interestingly, and one of them is pregnant. And then the gods have planned this whole thing, and Brahma comes and says, if there is any papa is often mistranslated as sin, it means demerit. If there is any demerit in this, it's fine, I take it on myself, you can go. And the boys, and there's many versions of this story I could go on, which are really wonderful. But the most interesting part is that the author says that the child is born of the enjoyment between two vulvas, so he is named Bhagiratha. And you know Bhagiratha, a famous hero who brings the Ganga down from heaven. So that's not really the correct etymology of that name, probably, but the author insists that that is the etymology. Some examples from medieval India under Muslim rule. So the most interesting one is these two poets, Maulvi Mukarram, Baksh and Mukarram, who, when one of them died, the other one observed Iddat. Iddat is the period of mourning that is observed by widows, Muslim widows. And after observing that period of mourning, he inherited all the Maulvi's property. So it's as close to marriage as you can get, right? in this book, I looked at Urdu Rethi poetry from the 18th, 19th century, mostly written by Muslim, all of it actually, that is extant, is written by Muslim men. And in this, you have the detailed accounts of male-male relationships, which of course is common for Urdu poetry at the time. That's nothing special. But what's special about this poetry is the female-female sexual and romantic unions, in which there are many words for a woman's female partner and for sexual love between women. So one of these words is, I picked this one. There's a word dogana, which means your double, your other self. There's a word zanaki, and so on. And there are rituals that these women perform to perform unions. But here the poet Rangin, Saadati Arya Khan Rangin, actually uses the word shadi. He actually says marriage. He says they each take a carbon, they break it open, and then they feed each other. There's this image of fear. Then they get married among their female men already. The point is, polygamy was there. Men were marrying many women. And among their female companions, they have a female couple as well. So they may be married to a man, we don't know, but among their female companions, they have this thing. And then also some of these women might have been courtesans, which is a different matter. So anyway, this is a novel I wrote in 2021, where the two women get based in that period, 18th century, one Muslim, one Hindu courtesan, where two women get married by performing a ritual that's witnessed by their female friends. And this is attested in the Urdu poetry and prose. So I'm going to conclude with what some Hindu teachers have said about this. So this is the 93 wedding of Michael and Aditya, which Swami Bodhananda performed. So for my book, Love's Right, I interviewed him. He said many very interesting things when I interviewed him. But one of the things he said was that when he was asked to do this, which he had never done before, he said that they want to live together. They want the blessing of God's parents and elders they must have. So then he chanted a mantra for their prosperity and love. He also said to me, all relationships are the same. There's no difference. As a Swami, obviously, he would feel that ultimately you have to go beyond desire and towards liberation, right? But as long as you are in a relationship, whether it's with a man and woman or two men, two women, it's no different. He said they'll all have the same problems and the same, the same issues and the same kind of life. It's not that different. So, and that's a very important point, I think, that it's not different. It's the same, really. So again, when Mala and Vega got married in Seattle in 2002, I was there and I short, brief interview with that Swamiji. It was a long interview. And he said to me that when he was asked to do it, he had never heard of such a thing, but he thought about it. And he said, well, in Hinduism, marriage is a union of spirits. It's not a contract. Unlike Muslim marriage, it's a sacrament. It's a union of spirits. And the spirit is not male or female. I think people of most religions would agree that the spirit, nobody would say that the spirit is male or female. So if it's a union of spirits, then why should it not be done? And he also, I think, cited rebirth. Rebirth was cited by many priests. Anyway, then he also said on this question of Papa, if there's any demerit associated with it, as Brahma says in that story. So he said, whatever money, he's a computer engineer in the daytime and a priest in the evening. So he's not living on these earnings. So the money he got, he donated it to the Shiva temple in his village in India. So he's not getting anything from it. If there's anything, he's giving it to Shiva. So which is also an interesting idea. Yeah, this is the picture I wanted, Aditya and Michael with the twins now. And so by being forced to be in England for 2.5 years of COVID, and not being able to come back to tourist visas were open up, Michael basically had to be on Zoom with his children and his husband. And these children, it's a big loss to have lost at this age 2.5 years with their father. Okay, so and I want to conclude with one more answer, because I know this question always comes from LGBT people when I'm giving this talk, which is, why should we have marriage at all? Isn't marriage a heterosexist, patriarchal, whatever institution? Okay, so I don't have the slides here, but the argument I have made, my answers to this are 2 or 3. First answer is, I do not consider marriage to be a heterosexual institution. Why? Because I've shown you that it was not a heterosexual institution, either in Greece or in Rome or in India and many, many ancient societies. So I have argued that in India, at least, in the Hindu text, friendship is the most important relationship from the Vedas onwards, right? Friendship between humans and gods, friendship between humans, that is the primary relationship. All the other relationships are types of friendship. Marriage is a type of friendship. When you take the 6 rounds and say those vows, the last vow is for friendship, sakha. You address the spouse as sakha. The last vow is for friendship. So marriage is a type of friendship. And then I've also argued that friendship is a type of marriage. Friendship is a type of marriage if you read Aristotle, if you read the Panchatantra, etc. So it isn't heterosexual or homosexual. These are anyway modern words and modern categories. Marriage or union, the desire to be in a union, is a very, very old one around the world, whether we like it or not. We may not like it, but it's a fact of life. Okay. Second point is that when that when you may say, why do you need to get married? You can just live together. I would give an example of why you need to get married. So the parents can't come and take the person away and make all the medical decisions so that you can get a visa, you can have it. So now, why not abolish marriage altogether is the third question often asked. So sure, I would say, fine. First, abolish straight marriage, which has been around for much longer. And when that movement, when you succeed in doing that, fine. Then same-sex gay people won't ask for marriage either. It's fine if you want to. Why does the idea of abolishing marriage only arise when gay people want to get married? It never occurred to you all these years. Has there been any movement for abolishing straight marriage? No, right? So if you only want to abolish marriage when gay people want to get married, then I would say that this is another version of homophobia, basically. And another point, you say it's a patriarchal institution. Okay, marriage is an institution that has been changing in every society, including India, has changed drastically. If you compare biblical marriage to modern marriage, Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. That's no longer legal, right? Men in most societies were marrying more than one wife. Now, in most societies, it's not allowed. Women didn't have any rights, custody, divorce, etc. All that has changed. So marriage has changed drastically. It's no longer what it was even 50 years ago, let alone 500 years ago. Same-sex marriage is another version of change, right? So it's not a fixed institution, is what I'm saying. And let me give you an analogy of the university. The university which descended in the West from the monastery, the Christian monastery. What does the word professor mean? It means one who professes the Christian religion. You couldn't be a professor at Oxford or Cambridge if you were not professing the Christian religion, if you were a Jew, for example, right? So, but should we then say, then let's not join the university at all? Virginia Woolf actually did say that. My PhD was on her. She said women should join the university because it's a patriarchal institution. I'm sorry to say that she was wrong there. Women joined the university and the university has changed, right? So marriage is just like that. It's an institution that changes over time. Yeah. Okay, so let's stop there.
So Ruth, so many questions in my mind. The very first question that comes to mind is, you've given so many examples of, same-sex marriages that have been happening in a religious tradition for so long. And, it's been happening in our country for, century, I would say even a millennia. When did this all stop? So when did we start to when did we all, get so conservative suddenly and nobody wanted to talk about it and everything suddenly stopped?
Basically, it's the British rule. You can place it fairly clearly. So I gave you the example of the Urdu poetry that has been written in, say, up to 1857, basically, openly written. And these are major popular poets. They're not minor poets. And they're publishing all these poems about male-female love, female, all together in their collected works. So that's there. And by the time you get to the 1920s, it's become unspeakable in India, which it never was unspeakable in India. It was unspeakable in Europe. But the poet Ugra, the novelist Ugra, whose stories on male desire are translated, Chocolate, when he published that in 1927, everybody told him, don't write about this. This topic must never be mentioned in polite society. If you write about it, you will be seen as homosexual. This is not to be written about at all. So in 100 years, less than 100 years, a complete turnover. And the reason is, I think, British rule, when the British first came to India, some of them were delighted to find that the situation was completely different from their country, where Urdu poets were openly writing about this. At the exact same time, Lord Byron in England was changing the pronouns in his love poetry to men when he had to publish them, right? Love poetry to women, he writes openly, right? To men, he changes the pronouns. So that tells you the difference. He could have been executed in England for that. And in India, we have no record of any execution for this, right? No imprisonment even. So this was the difference. So some of the British were happy to find this, but many were also horrified to find this. And in 1857, when the Crown took over officially the rule of India. 1861, they passed 377. So that's the turning point, isn't it? Yeah.
So that leads to a question about what seems like cognitive dissonance, right? Because for the last 30 years, for better, and I think probably for worse, there has been increasing nationalism in India, right? We're trying to change old British names back to the original name. So Bombay became Mumbai. We have seen a sort of a rejection of Western imposition of culture and traditions. And yet, your argument here would be that in many ways, recognizing same-sex marriage is a return to who we were before the Western influence. So I do wonder, given that you have so meticulously tracked this history for over 2 decades, what is the reaction of these so-called Hindu nationalists when you say this is actually who we are, this is what our Hindu texts and scriptures are rooted in?
Oh, I think it's changing in all political parties and across the national political spectrum. On this issue, it's changing very rapidly. And also the fact is that gay people are not a separate community. They are born in everybody's families, right? So everybody has some relative. So that's an important factor. But it's definitely changing. There are lots in every party and in every group. There was a division. People were fighting about it, about 377, for example. There was conflict. No party was fully in agreement. They all came around to saying that 377 should go. They all did. And even same on marriage. It's just going to take some time, as it has in every country. It's going to take some time, but I am confident that it will happen. Maybe not in this round, but maybe in this round, but maybe in the next round. But it will happen. So yes, and the reason why we did is that we didn't know. I didn't know all of this. So now I'm saying all this, but when I was doing my PhD in India, I didn't know that all of this existed. So now we have made it. It takes time to filter in a huge country like that. It takes time for people to come to know all this, right? So they didn't know. We didn't know. How many people are actually reading the whole Mahabharata? How many people are reading the Kama Sutra? You have some vague idea. And that the Kama Sutra, the version of the Kama Sutra that everyone read and at the time in the 80s and the 90s, it omitted the chapter on same-sex desire. Now they published the full thing at that time. The pavement versions didn't have it. So most of the time you just don't know, right? And it comes from ignorance of our own history, because we have this colonial education system, which makes it vanish. So makes not this vanish, but many other things vanish as well. Yeah.
And it's so interesting that, a lot of these are religious weddings. So Parag, in my case, and Ruth, I wanted to share this with you as well. So in my case, when I came out to my mother, what actually helped her understand was actually taking the perspective of Jainism. And Arun knows this well. So I had actually done a seminar about Jainism and homosexuality. And it's exactly the same as Hinduism, where it talks about union is between two souls, never between a man and a woman. And actually in Jainism, we have more than two genders. We actually have a third gender, but if you go back into the scriptures, there's so many other genders. So when I tried explaining that to my parents, it made so much more sense to me. And I remember after that, my mother said that, Beta, it is possible that, all these people, now I'm trying to understand this. So many years ago, there were men who would just not get married or would just move in with people. Then suddenly there's a light bulb moment. She's like, oh, that's what it was. Possibly these people were gay. They just weren't talking about it. Right. So it's so fascinating to mention that.
Every family knows that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, Ruth, you talked about why it's important not just to have the religious ceremonies, but to also have the legal rights. And of course, Vaibhav and I are currently petitioning in court for those legal rights. In the United States, during the campaign for marriage equality, we would often have this talking point that there were 1,100 federal U.S. rights that were granted through marriage. Right. I'm curious if you could help us. You talked about a few of these ones, right? The right to make medical decisions, for example, the right to get a visa. Could you talk about some of the other really critically important rights that are conferred by marriage and why marriage has to be a legal right?
The Indian government doesn't give as many rights as the American government gives. For instance, filing income taxes are done by individuals. Even if you're married, you file income tax as individuals. So those many things it's different. Mm-hmm. So I think the crucial ones are hospital making decisions when a person is ill, funeral, making decisions about the funeral, inheriting without a will. And if you can make a will and endow your partner, but then that will can be contested. In the Indian courts, they send out the will to all the so-called next of kin, and they give them an opportunity to contest it. If you're married, then you are indisputably the next of kin, right? So that's important. Adopting or having a child together is another thing, like who appears on the child's birth certificate. So that's another whole thing, but it's connected to marriage. It's not the same, but it is connected to marriage. That's another one. So those are and the visa. If you marry someone who is not an Indian citizen, the visa and the right to stay. So if you get an OCI, you have a right to stay in India. The only thing you can't do is vote or hold public office. But you are an overseas citizen of India. You can stay in India. You can have a job. You can open a bank account. You can do everything. But if you are not, then you're just a tourist. And then you're a legal alien. If the foreign, and this has also happened in the case of one couple, this foreign spouse falls seriously ill in India, then the partner is a legal alien, one thing. And then the hospitals are not allowed to treat tourists on a long-term basis. But if you're living in India, then you have to be treated there. So then you have to get around that somehow. That's a very tricky one, which I didn't know about, but I just came to know recently due to this happening to somebody I know. So yeah, there is many rights, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure there are many more rights that I am not. There's things like inheriting the insurance policy, the being on the Provident Fund, being on the next of kin for the pension and all of that. Some of those are changing bit by bit. Different companies and corporations are changing it. The Life Insurance Corporation recently said that your partner, you can be a nominee for your insurance policy. But and that's a government-owned corporation. But it's piecemeal, right? So when you get married, you get all the rights at once. So that's
and that's exactly what happened in our case. So when COVID hit, my father got really, really sick, and he was hospitalized, and I was able to travel. But Parag, being in OCI, he's actually, remember, Parag, your visa was suspended, and we couldn't travel together. And Parag's worry was, if you go travel over there by yourself, both your parents are sick, something happens to you, I will have no legal right over you. Even if I come to India in an emergency and try to claim anything, any medical decision for you, for your family. My dad has, mentioned this, that, I'm getting old now, if there's property that I want to give you, I want to make sure that I'm, distributing it equally between you and your brother, your sister-in-law, and Parag. He cannot really do that at this moment. So, that's...
Yeah, he can make a will and leave it that way. If it's contested, it's a different matter.
Then it's contested, yes. So that's one of the reasons I actually...
But it also came up in our court case, because when we had one of our hearings during COVID, this was all being done virtually, one of the arguments that the Solicitor General of India made is that this is not a priority issue. Given everything going on with a public health emergency, this is not a priority. And what we were trying to help him understand is these two things are connected. You cannot talk about the emergency of COVID without talking about the fact that there are a whole set of us who are excluded from the medical decision-making and the traveling rights. And so I'm just wondering, what has sort of been your conversation and argument with government officials in India about why this should be a priority? Why is this urgent?
In Section 377 case, all the arguments have been made. If you read those arguments, you remember that when the Supreme Court overturned the decision in 2013, they said it's a minuscule minority, they misspelled it. But it's a minuscule minority. And so now that is not an argument. Even if it's one person who's affected, that person has all the rights, right, to have the constitutional right. So that's not a good argument. There's not a priority. That's what the Marxists used to say, women's issues are not a priority. After the revolution, we'll say take care of it. But that's not, it's a priority right now because people's lives and deaths are affected by it. It's a life and death issue. I gave you the example of a woman whose partner actually died, right? So the point is that it's either it's a constitutional right or it's not. How many people it affects is not the question. So if you read the Section 377 judgments closely, I think you'll find all the arguments made there. The judges were given all the information. They were given this information about the history, the literature, everything. And it's an extension of the same. It's an extension of the same case, really, right? Isn't it? So I think these judges should also be made to read all that.
So we're getting a lot of questions, but two quick questions for you. One, has the government of India, done any engagement with you at all? Have they reached out to you, or have you reached out to them, sharing your research, all that you found? And second, I'm a big proponent of language access. In fact, when Parag and I got married, I understand there's so many that don't have access to, the literature for, LGBTQ folks. In fact, for myself, I studied in a Hindi medium school. I picked up the English that I did watching American television and, whatever. So we, intentionally, when we got married, there were so many media channels from India. They reached out saying, hey, we want to share your story. And I told Parag, Hindi is very important to me. So we chose, to do this in Bharat Times. And so they could actually reach the masses. There were so many other regional newspapers, if you remember, who wrote about it. So wanted to learn also if you're doing any of this research and writing about it in Hindi or in Urdu or any other regional languages.
Well, I want to translate same-sex love in India into Hindi. It's a difficult, for various reasons, it's a difficult process, but I hope that will happen. My novel, which is actually, maybe a novel is better in a way that it gets things, it's easier to read. And so that I translated into Hindi myself under the title Pariyon Ke Beech. It was published by Rajkamal last year, which is the biggest Hindi publisher, right? So that's there. And then on the internet, people are working a lot with other languages. Bindu Madhav Khire in Marathi has done a lot of work. He's brought out a lot of literature in Marathi. So it's for you to do. You should do the writing. You can do it on the internet, on a blog or whatever. There's a lot on the internet. A lot of on the internet is also wrong, but a lot is also. So if you search, you will, wrong in the sense of just factually wrong. So you can find, I'm sure you can find, but yes, there's more. The Hindi publishers are very anxious to publish more stuff now. Rajkamal has actually made a list of what they call their LGBT publications. These are things they had published earlier, but they didn't realize they were LGBT. Now they're putting them at a list and actually marketing it that way. So they are very interested in publishing if you write about it. Yeah.
Interesting. And has the government had any engagement with you? Or
the government, somebody from the government, I forget her name, did write to me that, in the Section 377 case, they had instructed that you must do something for this minority, for their rights or whatever. So they formed a task force, or something was being formed, and that lady wrote to me saying, will you be on it? I said, sure, I'll be on it. And then I never heard from her again. So I don't know.